Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Janet Siegel, and I want to welcome you to our event. And may I start by saying, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the committee, which I chair, welcome to the 28th anniversary celebration of the International Day of Older Persons, organized in partnership with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the Focal Point on Aging and her staff, and sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the United States, to the United Nations, I apologize. This year is the anniversary, this year is the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our theme today will celebrate human rights of older persons. We are also fortunate today to have several missions as co-sponsors of the International Day of Older Persons, including the Group of Friends of Older Persons. This group of friends is comprised of over 22 member states, and I'm going to just quickly go over what they are. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Qatar, and Slovenia, and, South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, and Uruguay. We also have support for our program today through the generous contributions of Pfizer, AARP, and UNFCU. The NGO Committee on Aging has been working on behalf of older persons since our formation in 1977, raising world awareness of the opportunities and challenges of global aging. Through the Stakeholders Group on Aging, which we belong to, we have participated in the deliberations on Sustainable Development Goals leading to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The aging community has been successful in highlighting the need for inclusion of concerns of older persons and for making older persons visible. The NGO Committee on Aging will continue to engage in advocacy for older persons along with our committees on aging in Geneva and Vienna to protect the human rights of older persons worldwide, and as we say in our committee, to create a society for all ages. Today we have a distinguished panel to discuss our theme. We are the champions, celebrating human rights of older persons. This program would not be possible without the efforts of the chair of the UNIDOP, who is James O'Neill. You'll see him in a minute. The Focal Point on Aging, Rosemary Lane, Amal Rafe, Amin Lamrabat, and their wonderful teams in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. We have had a long and wonderful working relationship with Ms. Rosemary Lane, and we wish her the best in her new position. We also want to welcome Amal Rafe, the new chief of the Program on Aging Unit, DESA, and look forward to working closely with her on many issues. However, we also particularly want to thank the Permanent Mission of Argentina for their sponsorship of UNIDOP and all that the mission does for the Committee on Aging New York and for advocacy for older persons. Finally, this program would not be possible without the extensive, extraordinary efforts of the Committee on Aging, UNIDOP Planning Subcommittee, and the Executive Board. I'll now turn over the program to James O'Neill, who is chair of the program. James, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As chair, I have to go through a few housekeeping things first for those of you who might need to use the restrooms. You have to go out to the hallway that you first came in. Turn left, go all the way to the end of the hall, and on the left will be the restrooms. In the folder that you have the biographies of everyone who's speaking today, and unfortunately we had a printing error. You'll notice that the bio information for Ms. Matic is the same as the bio information for Dr. Gerderi. They are not the same. The doctor's resume, bio will be online later on this afternoon, so the changes are there. We're sorry. Printing office made a little mistake. We have to remind you that if you need to go out and when we leave, you have to go out by the third floor, except for those people who had special passes to come in on the second. You will not be allowed to exit on the second floor. So it's out the back way, the way we came in, okay? And the last thing is and I'll remind you, we're full for lunch, so thank you very much. And if you have brought a check or cash for lunch, we're sorry, but we have managed to fill our reservations, so thank you. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. It's a beautiful day. Good morning, honorable guests, distinguished guests, colleagues, associates, friends. Welcome to the 28th anniversary celebration of the International Day of the Older Person at the United Nations here in New York. We are the champions, celebrating human rights of older persons. Who are the champions? You've probably been asking yourself. It could be you or someone else in this room. It might be a colleague, a neighbor, someone you don't even know. Advocating for the equal rights of older persons can make anyone a human rights champion. The world is getting older. According to the researchers at the Leonard Davis School of Gerontology at the University of California, every 7 seconds, another American turns 50. By the year 2050, the number of people over the age of 65 will be about 1.5 billion with a B, 1.5 billion worldwide, representing 16% of the world's population. This growth is driven by longer lifespans and reduced birth rates. Japan became the first country to experience the explosion of older populations. The share of 65 years old and older became 21% of the country's population. Today, there are 4 other countries, large countries, with advanced populations: Japan, Italy, Greece, and Germany. What have they done to prepare for this explosion of older people? AARP estimates there will be 24 older population countries by 2025. That's only 7 years from now. What does this mean for all of us in this room, especially those of us like me who are aging over 65? Have countries prepared for the impact of this massive population shift on their finances? How will this be affected by the governments? What will be the response of younger people as governments attempt to respond to necessities and needs of a growing older population? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered. These people that advocate for human rights of older people, that keep older people from becoming invisible in society, a burden on society, suggest ways to support active involvement in economic, social, political activities in older adult communities. No one left behind, being inclusive and including all ages of human beings. These are older adult human rights champions. Human rights for older prisoners, caregivers and caregiving, human sexuality, and for those of us born before the Declaration of Human Rights existed, these are all topics that are going to be discussed this morning in our main session by our panelists. Young people, and yes, at times, some of us older adults, have to be reminded that human rights are equal rights and should be accessible to people of all ages, gender, orientation, social and economic status. These are the human rights champions that we celebrate in the 70th year since the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Ms. Siegel to come back and introduce some of our distinguished guests for opening remarks. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, James. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Martin Garcia Moritan, who is the permanent representative of the Mission of Argentina to the United Nations, who will give welcoming remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Janet, and Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, and thank you very much for being here. Let me begin by expressing our deep appreciation to the NGO Committee on Aging New York, the IDOP Subcommittee, and DESA for organizing this event. Like every year, it's a great pleasure for Argentina to partner with you in order to commemorate the International Day of Older Persons, the 1st of October. On this 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is of utmost importance to celebrate the rights enshrined in the Declaration and reaffirm the commitment to promote the enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by older persons. This year, our theme for the International Day is "We Are the Champions, Celebrating Human Rights of Older Persons." If we think about older people around the world who dedicate their lives to championing human rights, I cannot think of a better example than the elders. They are independent, global leaders who raise the voices of the voiceless and offer hope where there is despair. One of these leaders, former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, is a great example of a champion who continued working until his final days towards a more peaceful and just world. I would also like to thank the presence in this room of human rights champions. Helen Hamlin, thank you, Helen. Rosa Resnick, gracias, Rosita. And Florence Denmark. And congratulate them for their successful work and continuous contributions to our societies. The theme of this year reminds us of how important it is to redefine what we call older person. Active and healthy aging is a reality in the 21st century. Older persons everywhere are embracing life as they age in a clearly active and positive way. We need to be aware that a complete new narrative about the role of older persons is in the making, one of them that acknowledges their potential. As a matter of fact, they have been contributing for many decades, which is something that is often forgotten. It's only a matter of looking around and pay attention to the people that surround us. You will find incredible older people rich in experience and abilities. Leaders in business, politics, academia, health and arts, among other fields, are and have always been proactively contributing to societies from multiple perspectives. It is high time that we open our eyes and understand their valuable role. As regards the global current life expectancy, it is interesting to pose us the following questions. What do we want to do with an extra 30 years? How should we, as individuals and as a society, shape the trajectory of our longer lives? Today, the answers to these questions are in our hands. By the year 2050, older persons will be the highest growing age group globally, and any strategy must include them as active subjects and agents of change. To achieve that, there must be guarantees of promotion, protection, and enjoyment of all their human rights. This is a reality which imposes us the responsibility to analyze whether older persons' human rights are appropriately addressed by international human rights law. Well, this is an issue that has been discussed for a long time in the open-ended working group on aging. From Argentina's point of view, it is evident that the existing mechanisms to guarantee the full exercise of human rights by older persons have flaws. The main reason is related to the existence of a normative gap at the international level that must be filled by a universal legally binding instrument to address issues such as ill treatment, exclusion, stigmatization, discrimination, and the satisfaction of basic needs of older persons. It is only through the development of an international universally binding instrument that we will ensure the adequate protection of older persons against discrimination, violence, neglect, and abuse. To finalize, I would like to end by renewing Argentina's firm commitment towards advancing the issues related to aging in the United Nations and to advocate for the inclusion, meaningful participation, and full enjoyment of their human rights by older persons. On the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we all must engage to fully comply with the principle of leaving no one behind, by bearing in mind that only through the full exercise of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, older persons will participate actively in society. That is why a universal, specific, and legally binding instrument will provide sufficient standards to ensure the full enjoyment of our rights during old age. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I look forward to listening to the presentations of our distinguished panelists, and I am sure that we will have a very interesting discussion on the issues of aging. And once again, I thank you all very much for being here and wish you a very rich, successful session. Thank you.
It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Milenko Skoknich, Permanent Representative of the Mission of Chile to the United Nations. He will give welcoming remarks on behalf of the group of friends of older persons. Thank you, Ambassador.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us to speak here in this very important gathering. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, civil society representatives, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the group of friends of older persons at the United Nations here in New York. The group is comprised of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Qatar, Slovenia, South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, Uruguay, and my own country, Chile. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for convening this event in the 2018 celebration of the 28th anniversary of the International Day of Older Persons. The commemoration of this day was officially recognized by the UN in 1990 with the General Assembly Resolution 14-106, which designated October 1st as the International Day of Older Persons. We mark this day to remind us of the essential contribution that older persons continue making to the functioning of our society, and to provide them the adequate guarantees to fulfill this purpose, particularly fully recognizing their human rights. This year's theme on the We Are the Champions, celebrating human rights of older persons, is perfectly in line with the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the commitment to promoting the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by older persons. We are aware that the population of older persons is projected to reach 1.5 billion in years to come, and we have already seen demographic figures mentioned by Dr. O'Neill and Ambassador Garcia Moritan. And so, with the greatest and the most rapid increase in the developing world, and projections indicate that by 2020, older persons will outnumber youth globally. And furthermore, of course, in the years to come, they will roughly equal the number of children globally. So this scenario poses a key challenge to the development of our societies and emphasizes the urgent need to recognize that greater attention needs to be paid to the specific challenges affecting older persons, including in the field of human rights. With this demographic trend, it is undeniable that older persons can make a significant contribution to the social, economic, and sustainable development of their societies, if an enabling environment and adequate guarantees are in place. In that sense, it is imperative to fully empower older persons to allow them to effectively make that contribution, becoming not only recipients of special care and social protection, but also active agents and beneficiaries of change. It is further of particular relevance that intergenerational dialogue, solidarity, and coexistence are actively fostered, making our societies truly cohesive. Dear friends and colleagues, we recognize the efforts that the international community has already taken to empower older persons, to promote and protect their rights, to raise awareness of aging issues, and to strengthen national capacities in this area. The adoption of the Madrid International Plan of Action in 2002, the establishment of the open-ended Working Group on Aging by the General Assembly, the appointment of an independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons at the Human Rights Councils have been important steps to strengthening the protection of the human rights of older persons and identifying gaps in protection and how best to address them. However, this is not enough, and we need to take more concrete actions to protect and promote their human rights and their active participation in society. There are many issues that affect the enjoyment of the human rights of older persons, such as inequality, discrimination, violence, neglect, and abuse. And we are convinced that the existing legal framework, as well as the current setting of the Human Rights Treaty body system and mechanisms, are not sufficient in order to effectively and comprehensively protect and promote the rights and dignity of older persons. In this regard, the group of Friends of Older Persons acknowledge that there is a gap and a normative dispersion in existing the international legal framework of human rights law regarding older persons, and we are convinced that the best way to address it is through open and frank discussions regarding what measures to take in order to fill that gap. In our view, regardless of the level of implementation of existing arrangements and the main human rights treaty, there is a need to develop international human rights standards for the protection of the right of older persons, which have, of course, to be discussed in a thorough and transparent manner with all member states and relevant stakeholders. Dear colleagues, in order to conclude, let me say that we are committed to allow the full participation of older persons in social, economic, cultural, civil, and political life, without any restraints and free from all forms of discrimination and violence, as it will lead to ensure their dignity, empowerment, and their ability to fully and effectively enjoy their human rights and fundamental freedoms, actively participating in their societies and contributing to its development. For the members of the group, it's not enough just to visualize the gaps and challenges that affect the rights of older persons. They need to be empowered into genuine right holders and active beneficiaries and contributors to sustainable development, and it's the responsibility of all members of the United Nations to provide the necessary space for this transformation. The group of Friends of Older Persons will actively participate in these conversations. I thank you.
For those of you who are not familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we now give you a brief discussion of some of the articles that are important to us today.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. It is the first occasion on which the organised community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
The declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No discrimination, right to life, liberty and security, no slavery, no torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, equal protection of the law, no arbitrary arrest, detention or exile, fair and public hearing, no arbitrary interference with privacy, right to freedom of movement, right to seek and enjoy asylum, right to a nationality, right to marry and to found a family, right to property, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in government, right to work, right to rest and leisure, right to food, clothing, housing, medical care and social services, right to education, right to participate in cultural life.
These human rights are not country-specific. They are not a reward for good behavior or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the rights of people of every color, from every race and ethnic group, whether or not they have disabilities, citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their caste, their creed, their age, or sexual orientation.
The Declaration has generated action for human rights protection in many ways. It has inspired hundreds of human rights instruments that together constitute international human rights law and a number of international bodies and mechanisms for human rights protection. The principles of the Declaration have supported the decolonization struggle and have been enshrined in the constitutions of the newly established countries which have joined the United Nations. The Declaration has inspired national and regional human rights protection systems, including legislation and institutions. And it continues to guide the work of human rights defenders and advocates worldwide. Today, the Declaration is available in more than 500 languages and dialects, and it has obtained the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world. The 10th of December, the day on which the Declaration was adopted, is celebrated each year as Human Rights Day. The Declaration emphasizes the relevance of human rights in our daily lives.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
That was former First Lady Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped spearhead the campaign for adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights. So I hope that you gained something from that brief presentation. In your folders, you have cards. These cards are to be used to write questions that you will have based on the discussion from the panel. So if you'll please make sure that you have cards or a card in your folder. And if you have a question, what you do is you raise your card in the air and someone will come by to pick it up. And we'll try during the question and answer period to address as many of those questions as we possibly can. Once again, I ask you to look at your bio sheet, and I told you about the mix-up, the printing mistake with the bios. Just to let you know, and they will be posted again this afternoon, Dr. Jeff, as he's known, is a professor at the Touro College, and he's a psychologist, a doctor in psychology, and he's also a TV personality. You may have seen him on ABC or CNN, so he probably looks familiar to some of you. Otherwise, please make sure you read the bios that are in your folder. We are not going to spend time going through every bio. I just wanted to mention that because his was not listed here. Without further ado, we are very fortunate to have as the chair or the moderator of our panel, Craig McIver. I hope I got that right. Craig told me that he's been here for a number of years, and he's probably had more than twice the mispronunciations of his name as the number of years he's been here. But he said it's okay. Give it a try. It's better to give it a try than not. So, Craig, by all means.
Thank you very much, James. Well done. You pronounced it perfectly well. One of the 27 different pronunciations that I accept, so well done. Yeah. James, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our co-organizers. Thanks to all of you for filling up this room for today's discussion around the 28th International Day of Older Persons here at the United Nations. And let me welcome as well all of the folks who are following us on the United Nations webcast or who will be looking at this afterwards. Take that by way of warning that you are on camera. Take full advantage of that as we go forward in our discussion. So you see that the theme of our discussion today is We Are the Champions, celebrating the human rights of older persons. This is about celebrating the human rights of older persons, the human rights articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you just saw in the video, but it's also about celebrating the people who stand up to defend the human rights of older persons, including most significantly, older human rights defenders. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we're going forward. You see, joining me up here on the panel today is an excellent panel that's going to help us work our way through all or a good selection of the issues that come into play when we think about a life of dignity and equality for older persons everywhere. Issues ranging from the situation of older persons in prisons, the situation of the health, including the mental health of older persons, itself guaranteed under international human rights law, the sexuality of older persons, issues of intersectional discrimination. Older persons are not a monolith. They are a very diverse group of human beings everywhere that they are, and we're going to dig in a little bit with the help of our experts to look at how issues of age intersect with things like gender and other status. To help us to do that, we have got a really terrific panel assembled up here. I'm joined by Jose Alejandro Luxinger, who is a medical doctor and director of the Center on Aging and Health Disparities at Columbia University Medical Center. Welcome, Jose. Thank you. Helen Codd is with us, professor of social justice and law from the University of Central Lancashire in England. Welcome to Helen. Welcome. Jeffrey Gardere, who is a psychologist and human rights activist. Welcome to Jeffrey as well. And Miroslava Matic, who is a member of the Red Cross of Serbia and an activist in her own right. Welcome to Miroslava. Lovely to have you with us again. You have as well a voice, and that voice is going to be heard, although it's going to be heard in the form of the white cards that you have in your folders. We're going to ask you as we're going forward to think about some questions or contributions that you would like to make to this discussion, because after we've heard brief presentations from all of our experts, we're going to turn to what you have contributed, and we've got colleagues who will be making their way around the room to collect those and make sure that they get up to us, and we'll be able to continue this conversation to about 12:40, I understand. I won't waste time with going into more detailed introductions than what we've just done, but I want to kick off our conversation a little bit by just recalling a question that occurred to me recently, which is why is it that when you think of the legions of human rights defenders around the world, starting but not ending with Eleanor Roosevelt, why is it that so many of them are older persons? Why is it that whenever you attend an event or participate in a rally or engage in reform initiatives, the room always includes older persons in the conversation? And why has it always been so since Eleanor Roosevelt and before Eleanor Roosevelt? What is it about the accumulated experience and expertise, to be sure, but also the lived experience with justice and the lived experience and witness of injustice that leads so many older persons in our communities and in our countries to become leaders in the defense of human rights for their own communities and for others around them? I think it's an important question. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, when she had concluded her framing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the first UN Commission on Human Rights, she said, "I could not at any age be content to take my place by the fireside and simply look on. Life," said Eleanor, "was meant to be lived." She was so crucial, together with the other voices that you heard here, in framing the building blocks of what was supposed to be a new international order, an order of freedom from fear and freedom from want for all people without discrimination. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights cataloged all of those rights in a remarkable way, but one thing was missing. While it referred to discrimination on the basis of race and color and sex and language and religion and political or other opinion, social origin, property, birth, or other status, there was not a single word about discrimination on the basis of age. Well, times are changing. We are now living in a world where people are a large and growing constituency who are having a stronger and stronger voice in demanding their rights, but who are also subject to particular forms of abuse simply because of the status as older persons. Many older persons are still suffering from exclusion, discrimination, vulnerability, deprivation, and abuse. Denied work, denied social security, essential services, and the full range of their economic and social rights. Sometimes denied a voice in political processes or targeted by violent criminals. Older persons who are capable of making their own decisions about their social life, about their economics, about legal decisions, about medical care, about housing, about their sexuality, about everything that a dignified person wants to decide upon for themselves, are sometimes denied the capacity to do so. These are classic human rights violations, and human rights defenders, including older human rights defenders everywhere, are standing up to say, this is no longer acceptable. I think we heard earlier this morning that there are gaps in the international protection of the human rights of older persons. We in the UN Human Rights Office are convinced that we need to fill those gaps, including with a dedicated treaty on the human rights of older persons to stand alongside the treaties we have on the human rights of women, of children, of migrants, of a whole range of other human beings. So it should be for older persons. Today, older persons are living longer, working longer, creating longer, participating longer, marrying later, educating later. They are living the full range of life experiences at the pace at which they choose to live them. This is nothing short of realizing their human rights. Those human rights have to be defended. Let's see what our experts are saying about some of the issues that come up in the struggles for the defense and advancement of the human rights of older persons. I'm going to give the floor first to Helen Cott. Helen Cott has done a lot of work on diversity and rights, in particular with regard to gender and aging. And Helen, there is a community of persons out there whose vulnerability is layered because they are held in prisons. Deprived of their liberty, and on top of that have to suffer the forms of discrimination that I've been speaking about. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and your ideas on older persons and prisons and their human rights? Helen Cott.
Is this on? Yes. Yeah, I've been working on issues relating to older people and prisons for, well, probably about 28 years. And most of my work has really been on prisoners' families, prisoners' families. And when I first started doing the work, older prisoners, because they're kind of a minority within a minority within a minority. So older prisoners are a minority, and then older women prisoners even more of a minority. And you end up with, because just most prisons around the world are full of young men, older people kind of get ignored. If you're playing that kind of numbers game, there are fewer of them. But of course now there are more and more of them. And there's a whole bunch of things that affect older prisoners' experiences of prison. You've got the kind of mobility things, you've got the environmental things, you've got the physical things where older people may not physically be able to get to the dining areas, they may be able not to take part in social things. But you've also got those kind of experiential things like issues around education. How do you educate older prisoners? Because so much prison education is about employment when they get out. What about things like visits? You know, prison visits, and I do a lot of work on prisoners and young children. A lot of prison visits are set up for prisoners with young families. What if you haven't got a young family? What if you haven't got a family? And And I'm really looking at ways of working with older people to co-produce new ways forward. I mean, ideally, I'm not particularly pro-prison anyway, and I'll put my cards on the table and say, I would actually like to see quite a lot of decarceration. But where people actually are in prison, and there are some people who, are very, very dangerous, then actually we have to make prisons as human rights friendly as they can be. But I'm going to say this now. I'll say this in my speech. We talk a lot about age-friendly environments, and my big problem is actually prisons can never be age-friendly. They're not friendly to anybody. And so that's really what I'm going to be talking about.
Please. Thank you very much, Helen. I have to say, I applauded. I was an applaud person of when there, because on your point about the overuse of prisons and our tendency to incarcerate people more than we need. So let me let you continue and finish what it is that you wanted to say, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Yeah.
Okay. Am I doing my actual presentation? Thank you. Okay. As I said, I've been working on this for quite a long time now. And can I have my next slide? This is one of my favourite quotations from a poem by T.S. Eliot, which says, "At the end of all our exploring, we arrive where we started, to know the place for the first time." And I feel a bit like that. I feel like I've come full circle in my career from starting out looking at older women as offenders, working at prisoners' families, and then suddenly come back to older people again. What we are seeing at the moment is rising prison numbers in many jurisdictions. And this is partly due to a punitive term in corrections, where many countries are imprisoning more people for longer than ever before. And also increases in average sentence lengths. And this is particularly the case in the US, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Now, the reason we have increased numbers of older prisoners, we have people living longer. We are now experiencing in many countries prosecution for historical abuses, including sexual abuse of children. And so we're prosecuting people now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s for things that happened 30 or 40 years ago. We are also seeing prosecutions for war crimes in some countries, which happened a very long time ago. We are seeing people living longer and dying in prisons in countries like my own, where we've abolished capital punishment. And I'm going to put my cards on the table here and say, I'm not for a minute arguing we need to execute more people. But what I'm saying is where people are actually living longer in jail, that's adding to the rising high prison numbers of older people. We're also seeing limited welfare provision and welfare cuts in many countries, including my own. And in some countries like Japan, the research is showing that older people sometimes intentionally commit crimes to get themselves incarcerated simply as a way of getting care, because the welfare provision simply isn't there. So what we're seeing is often referred to as a greying of the world prison population. Now, in terms of research, there's been a lot of research in some jurisdictions, in the US, the UK, and Australia. The focus has tended to be on mobility and healthcare, and a lot of the focus has been on physical living environments. And as I've already said, there's big issues about things like spiritual, social, educational needs. And there is actually a debate to be had here, because most of the US work and the UK work has been about special wings in prisons for older people, special units. But there's actually a real argument about whether we should have intergenerational, multi-generational units, where we don't separate out older people, we actually have multi-generational units. And that's a really debate to be had. Now, I said that 25 years of my work has really been about prisoners' families, and a lot of that's been about prisoners' children and prisoners' kids. But I've been thinking recently, not just about older prisoners, but actually about their family members who might let themselves be older. If you're 60 in jail, your mom might be 85, 90. If you're 70 in jail, you might have a parent who's 95 or 100. Similarly, if you are 95 years old in jail, your children might be 75, and so on. And so when we talk about older prisoners don't usually exist kind of on their own in a vacuum. They have these family networks, and sometimes those people themselves are older. And like older people don't figure much in the prison literature, older prisoners' families don't figure much in the prisoners' families literature either. So we have this kind of big black hole where people just don't get mentioned. There are big debates about commonality and difference, which I'll come back to in a minute. Can I have my new slide? But when we talk about prisoners' families, then we hit real problems like, I know that in New York State, you've got some local prisons here, for example, but many prisons are upstate. I've been to Bedford Hills Women's Prison, which is way upstate. And in many countries, prisons are really difficult to get to. So prisoners' family members may have real problems going to visit the prison. And when they get there, the prison setting itself may not be very accessible. Visit rooms they vary in quality, but even most of the prison family programs, and some of them are great, there's some great family programs, particularly Storybook Mom, Storybook Dad, and so on. But they're pretty much set up for prisoners as parents of young children. And I've been saying, well, what about grandparents? What do older people want? Some older people may want to be in a room with lots of younger people, but some prisoners might want to be somewhere different. So the local open prison near me back home, they have a visits room, and it's all very kid-friendly, and it's great. But they also have a carp pond outside where older people and their families can go and walk and talk and sit. And so it's about recognising what older people themselves want. And we have to face up to the fact that for many older people in prison, death, dying and bereavement are very real issues. There are real issues about terminal illness in prisons. There's real issues about how do you cope in prison, where suddenly you watch all your family gradually dying off as you age. And there's also issues about parole. For example, in Japan, parole is heavily dependent on having a family member go along and say that they'll take care of you. And if you haven't got that, it's difficult for you to leave the jail. And similarly, older prisoners may not have a supportive family, either because the family's cut off from them because of their offences, or because actually they've chosen to leave their family or they've died. So we hit loads and loads of issues. And I think my problem here is, when they said they wanted me to talk for 15 minutes, I was like, well, can I have 15 days? Please, none of you want to leave tonight, because I could talk about this stuff forever. But family has been described as a golden thread linked to desistance and preventing reoffending. But then you hit big questions about, well, isn't that just giving more of a burden to families to make sure that their family members behave? And how does that fit with the state? And, of course, ageing aggravates existing social exclusion, poverty, and inequalities. And we know that prisons are not places of equal opportunity. We know that people in our prisons tend to be the poorest. They tend to be the most discriminated against. They're already people living with poor health, poor education, challenging circumstances, and social exclusion. And ageing aggravates that. And thinking about family members as well, and I've done a lot of work on gender, there's a real gendered issue here, which falls on women, which is where we all talk about women experiencing the double burden as we age. I mean, I'm 50 next year, and my parents are in their late 70s, nearly 80s. And I'm becoming very aware that they are aging and they need me to do more and more for them. At the same time as I have a daughter who's nearly 15 who also needs me to take care of her because she's a teenager. And when you put prison on that as well, you don't just get the double burden, you then get the triple burden of the people, women mainly, who are stuck caring not only for their children and their parents, but actually you've got the prison setting to deal with as well. And regardless of where you go in the world, mothers are most likely to support long-term inmates. If you go to any long-term, particularly high-security prison setting where you've got the people who've committed the most scary crimes, the most hated crimes, it's the moms that keep going. The moms will keep going after wives, after girlfriends are left, it's moms that keep going because they're moms. But of course, many of those moms get older themselves. That said, sometimes older prisoners' family members are better able to cope simply because they may have had this experience of their partner going in and out of prison their whole life, so they're used to it. So, can I have another slide? So, what do we do? Well, the World Health Organization, as many of you know, has done an awful lot of work on age-friendly cities. And I found a lovely poster here, which is actually about New York as an age-friendly city, which I thought was kind of appropriate because we're in New York. And interestingly, in the WHO stuff on age-friendly cities, and I really want someone to correct me on this, but in all my work on age-friendly cities, I haven't come across any real mention of prisons. And some prisons are in cities and some are outside. But if you go to a toy store, and many of you will know about Lego. Kids have had Lego, little plastic bricks. And if you stand on it in the middle of the night in your bare feet, it really hurts. Well, Lego, if you go and buy a Lego city, you can get like a little police car, you get a little police station, you can get a Lego city prison, complete with little Lego city prisons and Lego city prison tables and stuff. You can get a Lego city prison, but your age-friendly city literature doesn't mention prisons. And it doesn't mention prisoners. It doesn't mention older people going into prison. It doesn't mention older people visiting prison. Prisons just kind of get ignored. And the other thing about the age-friendly city or age-friendly approaches is age-friendly approaches, which talk about things like ageing in place. Well, how does that work if you haven't got a place? And also, these approaches focus on choice and participation of older people and, working with older people to recognise older people have opportunities. But the key problem here is that prison, in its very nature, limits those opportunities. Okay? Prisons are not designed to be places of choice. That's the kind of a whole point of a prison. So I think the whole phrase age-friendly prison is a complete oxymoron. It can't exist. There is no such thing, and I will say here, as an age-friendly prison. And prison limits choices, not just for prisoners, but those who support them from the outside. Okay? And so what we end up here with, in terms of older prisoners, is effectively an unwelcome mat. I do like this, actually. It's a Halloween unwelcome mat, the pumpkin. Because what we end up with is older people don't really fit in prisons. Prison work doesn't really deal with them. Prison family work doesn't really deal with them. And then when we talk about ageing and human rights, nobody's really got to grips with that as well. So we sort of end up with older offenders not really belonging anywhere, hence my unwelcome mat. How long have I got?
5 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, so we sort of end up with this thing where older prisoners don't really belong anywhere. They're a minority in the prisons, their family members don't really get taken account of either. They don't even belong anywhere. They're pretty much left on this kind of penological unwelcome mat. So you say, well, where do human rights fit? Where do human rights fit? Well, we know about the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. There are many articles in there which directly relate to prisoners. Obviously, if you've walked along that corridor there, then you've seen this beautiful portrayal of the torture and degrading treatment article. And the question is, well, where do human rights fit for older prisoners? And I would say the most important thing about human rights and Universal Declaration is it is universal. We often forget when we see celebrated prisoners and people, and this is Nelson Mandela, for example, we forget he was 71 when he left jail. He was an older prisoner. We forget this. And when we talk about human rights, the reason I believe so strongly and passionately in human rights and in the Universal Declaration is that human rights are universal. They apply to absolutely everybody. Now, my lovely deceased colleague, Professor Barbara Hudson, who some of you might know her work on justice, and a wonderful woman, always used to say, we don't need human rights for people we like. Can I have my next slide? Now, most of you will recognise at least one person on this picture. I've tried to find representatives from many different countries. You've got Charles Manson, you've got Fritzl, Peter Sutcliffe from my own country, Klaus Barbie, Rose West. These people have all committed, many of them committed, some of Nazi war criminals, some have committed murders, kidnapping, or conspired with other people to murder. These tend to be the people whose names, dominate our mass media. Thank you. If I'd done this later, I would, of course, put Bill Cosby on here. These are the people whose crimes shock us. These are the people whose crimes, like child abuse, genocide, and war crimes, these are crimes that shock us. And yet these are older people. And so when we talk about older people, when we talk about older prisoners, human rights have to apply to everybody. We need universal human rights, not just for people that we kind of understand that we like. We need the human rights for people where actually they have done terrible things, because the key thing is they're still human. They still have rights because they're human. And again, I mean, I can talk about this forever. These are all older prisoners, and all of these prisoners are either going to die in jail or have died already in prisons. And, of course, many of them will have had family members who've carried on trying to visit, seeing them right up to the end. And, of course, then you hear other issues about death and dying in prison, which is outside the scope of today's meeting. So what I'm going to finish by saying here is that, when we talk about today, when we talk about the International Day of Older Persons, we have to recognise diversity of older people, and we have to recognise the specific needs of some of the most excluded older people who are prisoners, both male and female. And you might well say, well, where does the UN fit in? And we really need policies and practices co-produced with older people which look at transnational, transregional and global research and interchange of ideas and good practice. The UN is a fabulous place for doing that. UN committees and UN events are a great way of bringing people together. You can see that today. And what I'm arguing for today, and I mean, it's great to be here to have this opportunity, and I'd just like to thank everybody for bringing me, is that what we need to do now is recognise the needs of older people in contact with the prison system and work together so as to maintain human rights for everyone. Thank you.
Professor Helen Codd, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Codd, for that. I just want Helen to know that in the UN gift shop there's also a Lego UN building. So so you can replace your prison with that one. Let's talk about sex, if we can. Now that I've got your attention. Dr. Jeff Gardere is one of the most widely sought-after experts in the field of mental health. You'll know him as a prolific author and a TV commentator. But I want to say to Jeff, you know, older persons are dogged by stereotypes and myths in society, and sometimes those lead either to neglect of very important life issues, and even the denial of some of their human rights, including their sexual and reproductive rights and health, their own autonomy and self-determination over their lives. Sometimes their right to privacy is affected in all of this. All ideas that have been enshrined for 70 years, but with the silence on the human rights of older persons, this aspect of our lives in our senior years sometimes neglected. You've been looking at this issue very specifically. Let me ask you how we should be viewing the issue of sexuality for older persons in a world that is supposed to respect their human rights.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I'm supposed to make an announcement here, which is a really good one, which is if you have any trouble hearing, you have earphones next to every station with a volume adjustment, and so if the loudspeakers aren't doing it for you, please take advantage of the earphones that you have at your stations. And with that, back over to Jeff.
Are we on? Okay. So in response to your question, I think it's very important that we understand something that many of us already know, that sexuality is probably one of the foundations of good physical, mental, medical health. We can't segregate that. We can't say that's something that we put to the side, and we can't say that it's something, sexuality is something that is for a certain age range up until the age of 40 or up until the age of 50, and then after that you're on your own. And this is something that we do in society and something that we have been doing throughout the world. And so we need to understand that as people of a certain age, as senior people, that in fact we need to redefine our sexuality, but we cannot do it alone. We need the help of our family and friends. So with that, and thank you for that slide, sexuality is real for older persons. And it's not just talk. The statistics show a national poll on healthy aging, 40%, they polled around 1,000 people, and they found that 40% of those individuals between the ages of 65 and 80 are sexually active. And 2/3 of the respondents said that they are interested in sex, and more than half said that sex is important to the quality of their lives. And that's sex in all sorts of different forms, and that would also include, of course, sexuality throughout the rainbow. We know that sex is something, when it comes to identity, is something that's very fluid. So what happens when we don't consider the sexuality of older persons? What happens when we don't give the proper guidance, whether as family members, whether as institutions, whether in assisted living, whether by the medical institutions, our nurses, our doctors, and so on, well, we've seen that there has been a dramatic increase in sexually transmitted infections, especially with gonorrhea, chlamydia, and herpes are on the rise. The Kirby Institute found that the new diagnoses of gonorrhea more than doubled in Australia, for example, and the rates of chlamydia infections increased significantly, and we're seeing this really in many, many countries, of course, including the United States. Why is that happening? Well, I think a lot of it has to do, and I will take the brunt of this as far as being part of the medical institutions, that we're not talking to our seniors about sexuality. But we also find that family, well-intentioned friends, institutions also are not addressing this. We have a very big issue with desexualizing our older persons. We tend to see them in a certain light, and we use terms such as cute, or when they are expressing their sexuality, we tend to laugh at them as if it's something that is inappropriate. Or sometimes we find, and I've seen this, I've worked in nursing homes, where family members actually come in and out of love scold their parents or parent or an uncle or aunt for being interested in sex. Aunt Harriet, are you kidding me? You're too old for this. No, she's not. And part of that is because of ageism. I don't have to tell you what ageism is, other than the stereotyping of and discrimination against seniors, which is a human rights violation. Infantilization, where we treat seniors as if they are children. And this seems to be almost something that becomes a natural order. As parents, we raise our children. When we become older persons and we may lose a step or two, then all of a sudden our kids start looking out for us. I said to my own children, I said, look, as a senior person, I'm now approaching 63 years old. As a senior, and I'm proud of being a senior person, by the way. We are the champions, okay? I said, I hope you guys take care of me, and I hope you help me die with dignity. And my kids said to me, you're never going to die, and we may have to kill you. So part of the youth-oriented culture is another thing that is really hurting us, because we tend to see sexuality as only something that those, again, at a certain age or a range of ages can appreciate or can understand or be part of. But we know that it's something that we start with from the cradle to the grave. Now, also, let's take a look, next slide. Studies reveal, as part of this youth-oriented society that we're part of, that young people generally tend to rate older persons with being more negative, giving them more negatives than the positive. There are many more things wrong with them than things that are right. Discrimination and underestimation of their potentials in the workplace. When we're working with older persons, we tend to see them as being less than. Maybe their memory is not as good as it used to be, or maybe their vitality may not be there as much as we think that it can be. But I can tell you, do not let looks deceive. There are people who may not look very young, but are very strong, not only physically, but morally and especially intellectually. And then we have something called the negative image formation, where we just tend to see seniors, or the term older persons, as being people who are now outdated. They no longer need to be part of society. We need to put them away someplace. And at the same time, that diminishes their sexuality. One of the culprits of that would be, next slide, What we look at, especially in American cinema, the over 60 underestimated. A healthy look at the silver screen was a workshop that was put together by the USC Annenberg Center for Public Relations. And basically, it was a panel discussion on the portrayal of aging in Hollywood films. And they found some very interesting things. First of all, 40 is the sell date for women on screen in film. You see a lack of women's bodies aging over time. Secondly, the results of the study revealed depictions of characters over the age of 60 accounted for 11 to 12% of all speaking roles in studied films. And what we tend to see is even less of those numbers feature female actresses, women. And that is something that is absolutely amazing to me. As we treat women as second-class citizens, we do that in life. We seem to do that in cinema, and we're certainly doing it when they become senior persons. Joan Wickersham from the Boston Globe wrote a series of articles, and she said three things that I thought were very interesting as to why, the psychology as to why we seem to distance ourselves from senior persons, why we infantilize, why there is ageism, why there are these negative connotations, and why we laugh at them when it comes to their sexuality. And this is very psychodynamic, what she's saying. First of all, we're scared of the idea of frail bodies and strong passions. It's something that is a bit strange to us. How can the two of them come together? This is what we call a cognitive dissonance. Secondly, we want to tame old age and make it diminutive and cozy, something that we can control because we don't understand it. And she went on to say perhaps it's the only way that we can, as younger individuals, deliberately not deal with the prospect of our own later years. We're afraid of aging. We're afraid of what that status means. And that's why it is so important that we champion the rights of senior persons, because it's not about someplace where they land, but more than anything else, it's something that they have earned. The La Trobe University's Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society did something called Sex, Age and Me. And what they found out in working with many seniors is the general knowledge, the seniors had, the older persons rather, had general knowledge of the causes and symptoms of STIs, which is good, but poor knowledge in condom protection. They had less STI testing. There was a limited knowledge of safer sex practices, limited experiences with sexuality, education. Because of the era from which they came, there wasn't as much sexual education, and they did not actively seek sex information. An individual by the name of Dr. Bianca Filborn, who was part of this, said that people over 60 were brought up during an era when sex education was mostly non-existent. People were also more likely to marry their first and only sexual partner, so that when they went into assisted living, they didn't know how to date. And older people still carry a lot of misconceptions that STIs, when it comes to that, only bad people have STIs. So it can't happen to a senior person. So we also saw that there were real issues in nursing homes, that they did not provide an environment which was safe to express sexuality. So what are the solutions? And this will just take 1 minute, and let's go to that slide. Let's jump ahead to that. First of all, we need more sexual education. Policies and education campaigns aimed at improving STI and sexual health among seniors. And this is something where the UN can certainly help. Secondly, as physicians and therapists, we need to train our physicians and medical experts to talk about seniors, about annual checkups that include special health screenings, specific questions on changing sexuality, talking to our senior persons about their sexuality. The media They need to step up and have more senior persons as writers, directors, and producers so that we can have more meaningful stories and not make fun of older persons. I don't know how many of you saw The Intern with Robert De Niro, but this was an individual who was an incredible role model. He had a relationship, a romantic relationship with someone who he really did care for. Number one. Number two, he was a role model for everyone at the office because of his wisdom. And number three, he was a dapper-looking gentleman. Nursing homes. We need to see accommodations for sex and safer sex, more staff training, more sexual education for the residents of the nursing homes. There is the Hebrew home in Riverdale, and they were one of the first to address STIs and safer sex. They updated their 2013 policies to look at Alzheimer's and dementia and the importance of even seniors who have Alzheimer's, who what we call are incompetent, should still be allowed to have sexual relations as long as there is not a danger, as long as there is a safer sex practice. For physicians, we don't need to assume incompetence. That's what we tend to do. But most importantly, we need to see people as being competent. Even when incompetent, we need to work with them around their sexuality. We need to establish decision-making trees, such as proxies and the subjective standard, where someone at the nursing home can make a decision for the older person if they were in the shoes of the older person. And finally, just to close, senior and older person self-empowerment. What do we need to do? We need to talk with our partners about sexuality. We need to visit our doctors. When we are having a sexual issue, yes, we can talk to a sex therapist. That is allowed. We can expand our definitions of sex if we're having issues with erectile dysfunction, for example. There are medications for that, believe it or not. We need to adapt our routine as to what sex is. We need to know about safe sex practices. We need to age gracefully and accept that our sexuality is different, and we need to be an advocate. And let me read this last statement here. Whereas a body driven by hormones may be powerful in many ways for younger people, I feel that a mind driven by sexual awakening can be even more powerful, because when the sex is not here, then the sex is here, and it's something that is just as important. And so let me close by saying thank you for allowing me to talk about this. Let's make the world respectful to our older persons, for we are the champions of the world, my friends.
Dr. Jeff Gardere, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jeff, also for raising the issue of ageism and its impact on these issues. We've seen indicators where even in places where indications of sexism and racism are on the decline, indications of ageism are often going up. That's a really worrying factor. There are no places in our communities that are immune of this. Even here at the United Nations, sometimes in the corridors and in the conference rooms, you will hear ageist remarks. And really, I think my appeal on that is speak up, because speech has consequences. It does affect perceptions, and those perceptions affect actions, and that affects all of us, and we need to learn that it's not okay and speak up when that happens. So you may have noticed, speaking of our consciousness about these issues, that we have a gender-balanced panel up here. It's not an accident. It's because the organizers paid attention to make sure that amongst our four panelists we have equal men and women. So I am going to continue with the boy-girl order of things as we proceed here, and turn next to Miroslava Matic, our expert who has been with the Red Cross, and who's going to help us to look a little bit, Miroslava, at the issue of intersectionality. We said that older persons are not a monolith. They are a diverse group of human beings, and some of them are women, some of them are men, some of them are persons with disabilities, some of them are members of particular social groups. These things intersect. and help to define the experiences of people in this community. Can you talk to us a little bit about the relationships between the human rights of older persons, the rights of women, the rights of persons with disabilities, and others? Miroslava.
Well, what I could say about that is that these are the rights to fight for that we recognized much later since the time that the Declaration was adopted. I mean, in 1948, nobody really thought much about the women's rights and about the disabled persons, or not, why not mention the gay population rights. There are many groups who would like to have more rights, as we heard now, the prisoners. So the point of the Declaration is that it is being developed through times, and it has some changing nature which requires our reaction, which requires the changes in the society, because we must accept the things as they are, because the things are our lives, and our life is what we are, and if we are not, our neighbor is, so we have to accept it. Does that answer your question?
Perfectly well, please.
Okay. I don't think I can be interesting as much as my colleague. After sex, I must be boring, but that's... There's only... but I completely agree with him. May I just add my comment? I completely agree with him, and there is a beautiful book by my favorite writer, Paul Auster. I can't remember the name, but there is love between older people, the man who didn't expect after his wife died to find life again. And your last point, he said something like this. Maybe the breasts are not the things they wear or something else, but the skin is still the skin. And you know, the skin is the biggest organ on our body. It's a beautiful... I like Paul Auster very much, and that's the book I read many years ago, but I remember that. I was not old like that, but I remembered. Okay, my name is Miroslava Matic, a volunteer of the Red Cross of Serbia, and I'm here at the United Nations for the second time. I'm an English teacher, retired now. In December this year, I will have been teaching English for 50 years. I come from Serbia, a European country with the population of 7 million, where people over 65 make for 19.2% of population. Last year, I was invited to speak at the open-ended working group on aging. It was the first time for me to speak in the United Nations, and I considered it a small miracle, a once-in-a-lifetime event happening due to pure chance. Now, I must say that I'm extremely honored by this invitation. Thanks to the United Nations Committee on Aging for inviting me to speak, HelpAge for their support, and the chance to represent the Red Cross of Serbia. I'm also proud of the fact that I'm older than the Declaration and still active. That's true. This is exactly what I would like to focus on, importance of being active at older age. This includes being active citizen as well, and using the possibilities provided by the Universal Declaration in pursuing enjoyment of human rights of people from all walks of life. Communities in which we live will be enriched by older people taking a more active part in their lives. Human rights are an issue of importance to people of all ages, and I think it is important that we, older people, make our children understand the importance of being active in ensuring human rights are accessible for all, regardless of age, gender, social status, but also to make them aware that human rights are not to be taken for granted and that they will be facing new challenges in the future with development of technology that will in turn create disruptions in different aspects of the society, which will inevitably result in emerging new concepts in human rights. I belong to the generation born immediately after the Second World War in a country heavily ravaged by war, and in those first years, the whole population was striving to rebuild it and make conditions for work. We needed factories, houses, roads, schools, hospitals. In such circumstances, we were not giving much thought to the concept of human rights. We were focusing on rebuilding. Anyway, we had the right to work, right to education, we had health care, we had voting rights regardless of gender, although some political freedoms were harder to pursue in my country back then. My generation used to proudly say that we are the first generation to live our lives with no wars. I do believe that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights has raised people's awareness and contributed to general drive for tolerance and peace. Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted in 1948, 2 years after I was born. We grew up and grew old together. As I was growing up, the country I was living in has, after the Second World War, made efforts to develop an equal society for citizens of both genders with varying success. The society that was built was aligned with all the principles of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the modern society, even though this may not have been visible in the everyday life. Over the years, human rights-based approach became increasingly important, and the changing nature of human rights showed us that the Universal Declaration should be expanded. Human rights are not a stale, unchanging concept. They grow and evolve with time, and as a result, we keep adopting new documents to better protect the rights of particular groups, such as women and persons with disabilities, due to the particular challenges these groups face. My own particular interest at this moment in my life is better protection of the rights of older people. In that sense, we can see the similarities between processes that led to creation of specific documents protecting women, children, and persons with disabilities, and the current process of advocating for the new UN Convention in the human rights of older persons. This new convention should address the blind spots in accessing certain rights that older people run into everywhere in the world. We need to bear in mind, of course, that the history of fighting for human and civil rights is a history of incremental changes. So we should be aware that the new convention will not change everything overnight, but we also expect from our governments to understand that it is important that this convention is adopted sooner rather than later. I have witnessed the emergence and growth of the concept of human rights during my lifetime, and I have also witnessed the rapid growth of technology. In my childhood, there were no televisions or washing machines in my neighborhood. When I started school, we used slates and pieces of chalk to write. Not every household had a telephone back then. Today, I can read, write, send mail, make photos, share my experiences, calculate, navigate, and many other things, even make doctor's appointments using only my phone. Aren't we the champions? So, it is clear that developments in science and technology make great changes in our lives, but it is important that we remember that many older people today do not have access to modern technologies, and that there is a risk that they may be even more excluded from the society if this is not accounted for. Many services today, public ones as well, require you to be online, and many older people still are not computer-friendly or cannot afford computers. and smart telephones. As a result, they cannot schedule doctor's appointments, cannot pay electronically, cannot access many other services. Technological development must always be matched with adequate development in the social sphere and in the sphere of human rights. Therefore, older people also have the right to access technology, information, and to be educated through these new technologies. Positive examples of older people exercising their rights are important. They are inspiring and motivating, while highlighting negative examples and advocating for addressing these issues is important to achieve change. As an example, an older woman in my country was faced with the situation of not being able to get a bank loan due to her age only. Many people would just accept this situation, but she would not. She petitioned the Commissioner for Protection of Equality in Serbia, claiming age-based discrimination, and the Commissioner reacted, and as a result, the Central Bank, National Bank of Serbia, issued a binding instruction to business banks that changed the way financial services are provided to older people in Serbia. One person, one older woman, was able to change lives of many other persons through her persistence and refusal to succumb to defeatism. She showed that change is possible, but also challenged stereotypes often associated with older persons. I also want to add, I'm very proud to be speaking here in the United Nations, and at the same time, an American citizen, a 92-year-old photographer, Harvey Lloyd, is in my country participating in marking of the International Day of Older Persons. There is a big exhibition under the title We Are the Champions in the main street in Belgrade. So it's a very nice example. So recommended for the future, because we are facing with the problem still in the future. We need to ensure more older persons participate in decision-making bodies at all levels, starting from local all the way up to the global level. Administrative procedures everywhere should be simpler and friendlier towards older people. For us, it is often difficult to understand official language in documents and complex forms we are required to fill. Older people have a right to health, and accessing adequate health care services should also be simplified by eliminating excessive levels of bureaucracy. Society, and particularly decision makers, need to put more focus on older people living in rural and remote areas. Their human rights must be guaranteed just like everyone else's, but for them it is much harder to access them. In general, societies must pay more attention and provide more care to older people as they are getting older around the globe. We have more older people in our societies than ever, and this population aging trend carries with it increase in issues linked to the older age, including chronic conditions, dementia, and other health issues that require long-term care. Older people also have a right to long-term and palliative care and to be able to make decisions about the kinds of support and care they receive. We need more affordable services for older people, from accommodation facilities to community-based services such as guarantor carers. We need legal assistance and advice, free or affordable for older people, when older persons are entering life care contracts, because abuse in such cases is rampant. I would also like to quote a lady from the last year, I remember, here in New York. I don't know her name, but I remember what she said. She said, "Old age is a gift, and we must be grateful for this gift, especially if we think of the alternative." That was true last year. This year is the 17th anniversary since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Human rights are universal by definition, and these rights to freedom and equality do not change in old age. We are the champions, and we are ready to continue to fight to build a world for all ages where we all can live in dignity and where our rights will be guaranteed and protected. And now I would like to show some quotes from some slides from other human rights champions around the world. Thank you.
Miroslava Matic. Thank you very much, Miroslava, for that. The questions are still pouring in. We're going to have a lot of fun with these. I'm getting hand signals here. I have no idea what they mean. You've got some quotes up on the screen, and we're going to work our way through them before we proceed.
Yeah, the slides.
I hope you people are fast readers because this... Thank you very much. Well, Miroslava mentioned technology and how important that is. It's important for us in this room as well. So I want to remind you that you need to get your hashtag on. The UN International Day of Older Persons, that's hashtag UNIDOP. So if you're not already tweeting, start doing so and get some of the wisdom that you're hearing from folks here out into the tweetosphere as well. Let's now move on to our next panelist. This is Dr. Jose Alejandro Luxinger. And Dr. Luxinger, you've been looking at some issues that are of huge importance to all of us. One being the epidemic of dementia and efforts to deal with that in a way that advances the health and human rights of older persons and patients of dementia, but also at this other absolutely essential element of the caregiver. That caregivers are themselves human rights defenders. And whether they are caregivers within the family or community volunteers or professional caregivers, they are unsung heroes in many respects. And I think you can tell a lot about a society in the way that it treats and protects and defends and remunerates its caregivers as compared to others in society. You've been looking very specifically at this intersection between the situation of persons with dementia and the situation of the caregivers, including their rights and their social needs in this formulation. So could you tell us a little bit about what your studies have shown about this? Dr. Luxinger.
So should I proceed with my presentation? Okay, thanks. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors. It's a real privilege to be here speaking to you this morning. So before I begin, I just want to emphasize that, of course, dementia is something that almost exclusively affects older people, so that is very clear that how it affects the rights of older people. But then caregivers, a sizable proportion are also older people over the age of 65. And a very large group is people who are on their way or in a critical period to become older people, which is what some people would define as middle-aged people, people who are between the ages of 50 and 65 or 40 and 65. So in these, so both dementia and caregiving are essential problems for older people. The other thing that I want to say is that I wanted to frame my presentation in the Declaration of Human Rights, and so there's four particular articles that I think my presentation applies to, and I would like you to think about them as I do my presentation. So the first one is Article 22, which is the right of Social Security, Article 23, which is the article to work, Article 24, which is the right to rest and leisure, and 25, which is the right to quality of life, to put it one way. So next slide. So I just want to say that I don't receive any industry funding. This is a usual disclosure for people who work in the medical field. Most of my work is funded by the United States government by the National Institutes of Health. Next slide. And then I just want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk today, thanks to the support and collaboration with many people, both who are academic stakeholders, but also people who belong to non-governmental organizations that have helped me along the years in my work. Next slide. So this graphic shows the expected increase in the cases of dementia until the year 2050 in the United States. So, I mean, the graphic says it all. It's going to increase, and it's going to increase particularly in the oldest people who are over the age of 85, followed by people between the ages of 65 and 84, and then lastly, the people who are between the ages of 65 and 74. And by the way, the people who are over the age of 85 is, in many countries, the fastest growing proportion of the population, so bear that in mind. Next slide. Now, the estimated lifetime risk for dementia is at age 45 and at age 65 is the following. So for men, 1 in 10, or about 10% of people who are 45 years or older, can expect to get dementia. And this proportion is much higher in women, almost 1 in 5, and this is slightly larger or when persons are 65. So we can all expect to be at risk for this problem. Next slide. And one of the things that is particular about the dementia epidemic is that while many diseases have been decreasing as causes of death. So, for example, you have to the orange bar, which shows heart disease. There has been a decrease between 2000 and 2015 of 11% in deaths caused by heart disease because of advances in care and prevention. The risk of Alzheimer's dementia, the number of cases of Alzheimer's dementia as a cause of death are increasing, which is the bar that you see, the purple bar that you see to your right. Next slide. And another important aspect about this dementia epidemic is that it doesn't affect everyone equally in terms of demographics, socioeconomic status, etc. So this is a graphic from a study from here in New York City, where Richard Mayu at Columbia University is the principal investigator. And what it shows, believe me when I tell you this, this is the meaning of the two upper lines, is that African Americans and Hispanics who tend to have lower education and a lower socioeconomic status in our neighborhood have a higher risk of dementia than whites. So it's important to consider that there is a disparity by demographics and by socioeconomic status. Next slide. And the other thing that, one of the things that could explain these disparities is that minorities and also disadvantaged socioeconomic groups tend to have more chronic diseases such as diabetes. So a lot of my work has been in the relationship between diabetes and dementia. Diabetes here in the United States is much higher. It's twice as frequent in Hispanics and African Americans as it is in whites, and we have actually checked, and there is a relationship between diabetes and dementia, and so a larger chunk or a larger proportion of the dementia epidemic may be explained by diabetes in Hispanics and in African Americans as compared to whites. Now, one important, what this statement says is a statement from an expert panel from the National Institute of Health, is that there is no known prevention or cure for Alzheimer's disease or dementia at the moment. So we don't know of any way to prevent this epidemic. Next slide. However, this is a table that is from a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very prestigious journal here in the United States. And this is from the Framingham study, which is a study of several generations in Framingham, Massachusetts. So I'm sorry if the letter is very small, but if you focus on the upper row, you can see from left to right that the numbers decrease. They begin at 3.6, and then they finish at 0.8, and in every column they're decreasing. What that means is that we have noticed in the last few decades that actually the incidence of dementia, or that is the risk of dementia, it's actually decreasing. And several studies in the United Kingdom and elsewhere have confirmed this. So what does this mean? It means that there's hope, because there is something that is happening, that the risk of dementia is going down. There is speculation that it comes from better cardiovascular health. I showed you in a previous slide, mortality from heart disease has come down. And now one of the things that we're saying is that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And I personally believe that explains, the improvements in heart disease and in stroke are reflected now in improvements in dementia risk. However, because the aging population is increasing, because something that's been alluded to by other speakers, there's been a demographic shift such that the proportion of older people in many countries and in most countries is becoming larger, then the absolute number of cases of dementia will increase despite the fact that the risk is decreasing. Next slide. So there is no cure for dementia, and the consequence is an increasing burden on families. And this burden seems higher among those with lower resources, who are at high risk of dementia because they have more risk factors such as diabetes that I spoke about before, but also they have less access to resources among those with low socioeconomic status. And, basically what this graphic shows, the one to the left, is that 59% of people who care for someone with dementia report severe emotional stress. And by the way, if you want to get the source of these graphs, you can go to the report of the Alzheimer's Association. They have a report every year. It's called the Alzheimer's Report. You can just Google it and get to it. And on the right, what we see is that also a very significant number of caregivers get physical stress in addition to emotional stress. So in other words, there's a significant impact on physical and mental health of caregiving for someone with dementia. Next slide. Now, another important issue is that interventions for these that are being designed to improve the health of caregivers and to help caregivers are not likely to work unless the social needs are met. And I spoke before that, I said before that we've seen disparities in dementia, that people with lower resources have a higher burden of dementia and dementia caregiving, and those people have less access to resources. So psychosocial stressors and lack of resources are particularly high in minorities. And a work from a social worker at the Hunter School of Public Health, actually she's the dean of the school right now, I think, Carolyn Gelman, suggests that unless these stressors are met, interventions for caregivers cannot be successful. So what does this mean? What this means is that I can go to a caregiver and say, look, I have this, counseling intervention to educate you and to have less stress, but, if the person is preoccupied with health insurance, with being evicted, with maintaining their job while they're caregiving for someone else, they're not going to be able to receive the intervention. They couldn't care less. So we tried to address this in several interventions in northern Manhattan, in northern New York City. One of them was this study, the Northern Manhattan Caregiver Intervention Project, which was funded by the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities here in the United States. And it was, we compared an existing intervention called the New York University Caregiver Intervention plus, case management by community health worker versus community health worker intervention alone. And I'm sorry about the small letters, but this is one of the publications that we had. And what's important here that I can point out to is that the age of the participants was around 59 years of age, so it was a combination of people who were middle-aged and had older age, that the majority of the caregivers were women, and amongst the women, the majority of caregivers were daughters who had their own families, and there's been talk here about, the pressures of, having to take care of elderly parents, but also having to take care of your older families. And then strikingly, a majority of these people earned less than $30,000, which here in New York City is actually not a lot to live on, even in the United States. Next slide. So what we noticed in this study is that over time, the stress among caregivers was higher with worse dementia behavior, which, it's not surprising. Just so the more severe the dementia is, the more difficult it is to take care of the person with dementia. But also younger caregiver age. So, compared to people who are over the age of 65, people who are in their 50s were more likely to have greater distress. And I think that may be because of all the responsibilities that these people have. Less satisfaction with social support. So the better quality of the social networks of the person, the better health they had, and the better ability they had to cope with the stress of caregiving. Worse health status. So even their self-reported physical health status was related to reporting more distress and also having worse coping mechanisms. So, the worst coping mechanisms were related to worse distress. So a lot of the interventions now are designed to try to address these issues. So another study that we did and that we finished 2 years ago was a study that was the first ever trial to compare two caregiver interventions in the world, actually. There were interventions that had been tested individually, but none had been compared head-to-head to see which one was the best. And here we compared the New York University caregiver intervention and a very well-known intervention here in the United States called the REACH. And we did it in a sample of 200 Hispanics from our community. And, again, what stands out here is that the majority of the caregivers were women. The majority were adult children with a mean age of 58 years. And, again, the majority made less than $50,000 a year, which is, again, not a lot of money here in New York City. Next slide. And what we observed is that people in both interventions at 6 months reported less burden, next slide, and also reported self-reported stress. So, next slide. We also have important anecdotes from this experience. For example, arrangements of spouses and or caregivers and recipients are non-traditional. So, for example, divorced spouses came back to take care of their husbands or their ex-husbands, because there was no one else to take care of them. Person with dementia cared by stepchildren with whom they really had never had a relationship before. Caregivers are afraid of losing their jobs. I would get calls all the time of people crying because they had to miss days of work because of taking care of a person with dementia. And then caregivers have difficulty navigating the healthcare and social welfare system for themselves and the person with dementia. So although there's resources out there, the caregivers are so overwhelmed with the problems of the person with dementia, they just don't have the time or the strength or the coping mechanisms to go look for the resources that actually exist and that are there. Another important thing is that we focus on the negative, but something that is being emphasized now are the positive aspects of caregiving. Many caregivers report a gratifying experience, and actually I've had the experience when I spoke to caregivers about caregiving almost in a negative tone, caregivers were almost offended that I was doing such. And so I've heard people tell me, well, my parents took care of me when I was a kid. Now it's my time to take care of them. And so we need to learn the predictors of positive experiences. And I think there's a need to facilitate early detection of dementia, because what happens is that we're not able to educate families unless we detect dementia early. So dementia is detected too late when it is too severe and caregivers are unprepared, and we're trying to test strategies for easy early detection of dementia in primary care. So in conclusion, the burden of caregiving is increasing because there is no cure for dementia and elderly people are living longer. The burden of dementia caregiving on those with lower resources seems disproportionately high. At the very least, I think caregivers need information about dementia, how to cope with it, and resources. And in my experience, they really appreciate this information. And then interventions need to be tailored to different age groups, family positions, and caregiver preference, because definitely not everybody is the same. Next slide. So anyhow, so I'm going to go just off script for a minute here, and what I wanted to say was I hope that it's clear how this problem, affects the articles of the Declaration of Human Rights that I mentioned. But I also wanted to say that, we had a breakfast with the organizers early this morning. One of the things that I was realizing as we were having this breakfast and hearing about the experiences of different people in different countries is that I think the UN is an incredible organization actually to address this, because I think that it's going to take, governments alone cannot tackle this problem. It's going to have to be a combination of government and a reorganization of families, societies, communities, groups of friends. And there's already many different approaches to this in different countries. So I think the UN is a fantastic venue to bring these approaches together and see how they can be, if you will, imported to other countries. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jose Alejandro Lexinger, thank you very much for that excellent overview of these issues. And it just reminds us all of how we need to, all of us, be human rights advocates in pressing for greater investment in research in the first instance for solving these healthcare challenges, but also greater investment in caregiving and in providing the right to healthcare and the right to dignified living conditions, whether those are at home or assisted living facilities. These are fundamental human rights questions, and we've got a lot of work to do. That brings us now to the next portion of our discussion. We've made it through. We've got to at least 20 minutes, I would say, for discussion. We've made it all the way through our panelists. And you've taken this issue of putting your questions on cards very seriously. I am buried in dozens of questions here, which I've tried to organize so that, because we'd never be able to get through all of them, so I've tried to organize them into categories, and we'll see how many we can get in here. We've got about a dozen different categories. I think the most questions I got are on sex, so I don't know why you people don't ever think of anything else, but thank you for those questions. So we've divided them into categories. I want to remind you again of the hashtag. I hope you're tweeting this stuff out as well to keep the conversation going. That's hashtag UNIDOP. That's the UN International Day of Older Persons, hashtag UNIDOP. We've got questions from you on older persons in prison, on activism for older persons, on sex, on care, on intergenerational approaches. There are a lot of young people in the room, a lot of young people involved in this conversation. They want to know as well how we bring the generations together in human rights solidarity on these questions. Some questions on violence, on ageism, and a lot of questions on what I'm calling the economic and social rights of older persons, economic and social rights codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and UN treaties as well. So I almost feel like having a spinning wheel so I can select one of these categories, but let's start with the one that I finished on. I'm just going to mention a few of them and then ask the panel to kick back on this category. One of them is about Social Security. There's a worry that Social Security may not be in existence in coming years, and already, I'll add, is not in existence for large categories of persons, not least women in most countries where you have contributory systems and so on. A question on health insurance, that people are denied the insurance they need to get the health care that the Universal Declaration says they're entitled to, including because of things like pre-existing conditions. This one mentions. Another one on why we don't do more advocacy to channel some of the trillions of dollars that goes into military spending out of that destructive enterprise and into social issues, including the human rights of older persons and their health and well-being. So in that category of what we can do to advance the economic and social rights of older persons, let me see if anyone from the panel would like to take a bite at those apples. Somebody's pointing to Miroslava, so we'll...
because you spoke about it.
I'm not an expert on that, but from what Jose said at the end, and we talked during the breakfast about, it seems that he is right. United Nations is a powerful place and the right place to make something, to make a lot for older people and their rights for the future, because we have to face it. And the government themselves cannot do much, not only because they do not have the means, the material, the funds, but because the problems of older people in different countries are different. We talked about that during the breakfast. It's not the same if you have a population, older population in Scandinavian countries and in Latin American countries, or in my country. So, and the governments, or the people in general, why only the governments? The society. I would say that we must turn to the society, the community, the place where we live. The intergeneration, the interaction between generations is also a good example. And I must say that it is also a way to help the older people. I will tell you how. But we must see how we can approach in the particular country. It's not the same, as I said, in my country, there is a tradition that children will help their old parents when they are old, regardless of how they love each other or not. It's their duty, more or less. In some other countries, I will not mention the country, but you know that there are such countries, there is not such obligations. But in those countries, maybe the government has provided good nursery homes or old people's home or residence places, whatever we call them, with good service, medical service or caretakers and everything, which my country cannot, or some other poorer country than mine. So we must rely on our children, grandchildren, and the like. Very often, the help will come from the neighbors, you know. And what I mentioned, the young generation. We tried in my town to make this connection with the young generation, with the kids, and we often make, I mean the club of pensioners, we invite the children with their teachers to come for some holidays, like Mother's Day or New Year or whatever. And we prepare a program for them, and they prepare something for us. We make them, we also had some kids from the school with hearing disability, and they taught us the sign language. So we try to make connection with each, among people in the community, as much as it is possible. It is maybe easier in smaller towns, which is the case of my town. Is that
That's excellent, and you've actually helped us to transition to the question about intergenerational approaches, which I'm going to give to the panel next. I want to say to the two medical professionals on the panel first, because one of the questions touched on it with regard to the resources for economic and social rights and so on. What could you do with $1.7 trillion? $1.7 trillion was global military spending just last year. $1.7 trillion in tearing things down. What could you do in terms of supporting caregivers and research to resolve some of the medical challenges and make sure people have dignified living? I make the point, or the questioner, I think, made the point, because these things are a choice. What we spend money on is a choice. What we care about as a society is a choice. And if we care about human rights, including the human rights of older persons, we will be spending some portion of that $1.7 trillion on the economic and social rights of older persons. We've piggybacked now into intergenerational approaches, thanks to Miroslava and her last example here. Several questions here. Panelists, I'll ask you about this. One person is asking about intergenerational exchanges between older and younger persons in structured ways. They mentioned, for example, technological expertise and exchanges around those. Others on the relationship between older and younger persons and how they can contribute jointly to human rights around the world. Intergenerational solidarity, they use the expression. Helen, one of them even talks about the relationship between older and younger prisoners, quite specifically. So given all of the dedicated young people who have joined in this conversation, what do we say about intergenerational approaches? Somebody like to take this one up?
I can give a very...
Please, we'll start with you.
My children, my youngest children, had a movie that they watched ad nauseum. You know how kids watch the same thing over and over again. It was called How to Train Your Dragon. And I think that is a story of our lifetimes. Our dragons at this point are our youngsters who perhaps are being, and I can only speak here in the United States, are being taught values about just survival, how to take care of themselves, how to make as much as they can. A lot of that may be environmental, a lot of that may be political, which I would not go into at this point. But I think as part of that, it is important for us as older persons, as parents, as grandparents, to begin teaching our children the value of an older person, to begin teaching them, and you talked about this, the responsibility they have to take care of family as they have been taught. And so as part of that, that can spread through our different industries. I know, for example, in the medical profession, and Jose, you may agree with this, that we don't spend enough time with gerontology. That's sort of like or geriatrics. That has become a field that in medicine, well, if you don't get into this field, if you don't get into radiology, you know, take a look at geriatrics. Or how can you work with people, older people, because they may not be as productive. It's a dead end. So we need to change that medical training, turn it on its head, and make it an honor and a privilege to learn from and to be able to work with older persons, what they are able to glean from them as far as values, as far as knowledge, as far as wisdom, as far as the human anatomy, as far as sexuality, can then be used to work with other populations, but taking care of that prime population is important. So I believe as we raise our children to be more respectful of older persons, as we make it important in medicine, for example, touch hours need to be provided for older persons first, because they're the ones who we have to get to first. Then that spreads throughout society. We see many more people concerned, younger people, such as the ones who are here, concerned about making sure and being outraged that things such as Social Security do not become privatized or that are cut, or that older persons are on their own. The lives they save of the older persons may be their own lives that they save later on in life when they get the mantle, assume the mantle, ascend to being a treasured and honored senior person.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm going to go to Jose now, and I just want to say these questions are still coming in, so I'm going to suggest now that we be really staccato and sharp in our replies so that we can get as many of them on the table as possible. So over to you.
So I'll try to be super sharp and concrete. So, I mean, I think there's two ways. I'll be provide concrete examples of how generations are connected. So, for example, one is a program that has existed here in the United States called Experience Corps, in which seniors are made volunteers or given opportunities for volunteering in schools, helping children read, helping children with their tasks, etc. So I think that's an experience of a top-down approach, if you will, age-wise. But there's also a bottom-up approach, which is to engage children and young people in ways that are appealing to them, to educate them about senior issues. So there's investigators at Columbia that have programs with hip-hop and dementia and hip-hop and stroke, for example, and they've reported, very successful outcomes. And so I'll just leave it at that for now, since we have to be short in our answers.
Jose, I have to ask you, does the hip-hop cause the stroke or save you from it?
No. So actually, it's education about how to respond to a stroke, for example. So actually, children are educated to recognize the signs, the same thing with dementia and things like that. I know.
I'm just a jazz guy. What can I tell you?
By way of punishment, we're going to make you do a little rapping before we finish up here. In the meantime, I'm going to give the floor, while you're thinking of one, to Helen.
I'm going to come in really quickly here. First of all, when we talk about relationships between older and younger prisoners, what we have to remember sometimes is they actually are relationships. They are biological relationships. We have fathers and sons and grandsons all in the same jails, in the same prisons. Prisons runs in families very often. It's the same families. So very often, sometimes, a son will go into jail and his dad will be in the same jail. I think in terms of relationships generally, it's really hard to say. It depends on the prison. It depends on the prisoner. We have to remember sometimes that some older prisoners are very, very powerful people. They maybe come from a background of organised crime. They may come from a background of a lifetime of crime, and I'm thinking particularly about gangsters, bank robbers, organised criminals. And in that situation, they are in incredible positions of power because they're right at the top of the hierarchy within the prison, and everybody else respects them. Okay, sometimes they're scared of them, but they also respect them. Flip side of that is people like sex offenders who are universally hated, and sometimes some very vulnerable older people get victimised because they are older. So it very much depends. But one of the big things is you often see a great deal of respect from particularly younger male prisoners towards older male prisoners who are often doing things like life sentences because they kind of get their heads down, do the sentence, they know how the place works. And so very often you will find that the younger men, although they may not like it to start with, will actually start really respecting the older prisoners. There's loads more to say about this. And we used to have a TV series in the 70s in the UK as a comedy series, which was actually about an older prisoner sharing a cell with a younger prisoner. But I can't talk about that now.
Intriguing. Okay, so we've only got about 8 minutes left, so I'm gonna go into our rapid round now, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull a category. This one is ageism, which several of you asked about attitudes and ageism and so on. And I'm gonna ask each one of our panelists not to give a sentence, but to give a bullet point. If you could do one thing, in the words of the questioners, to change the fears and prejudices and depictions about aging and older persons, what would that thing be? Just one answer from each of you, and you have to choose. And so I'm going to start with Miroslava because she was the first person to speak last time. One thing.
The oldest one. Some kind of idea or?
Just one thing that you would do to fight ageism.
That I would like to say. Well, if you have an older person near you, be it your mother, parent, or neighbor, or whoever, try to understand what is the real need of that person. It's not only the food, it's not only bed, it's not only warm clothes. I will tell you just in 2 sentences the example of my mother, who lived to 92, and when we asked her, she had everything, we asked her, Mom, what do you want? She said, I would like my son, to my brother, to put me in your car and take me to town. I haven't been in the town for 10 years. I want to see the river. I want to see the park. I want to see what has changed in the town. That's a very simple need, but we never thought of that. So that's what a live person wants to be the participant, even by seeing, nothing else. Food is there, everything is there, but in some way to be the part of life, the picture you used to live in. That's it.
Very good. Jeffrey.
At the Tour of Osteopathic Medicine, Tour College of Osteopathic Medicine, we teach our medical students about cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. I think at that institution, as in all medical institutions, social work, psychology, we need to also talk about, as part of cultural sensitivity and cultural competence, ageism. And I'll take it even further and say that we should begin teaching our children, as we have all of the different programs on respect, respecting other children, respecting children with disabilities, LGBTQI, and so on, that we should begin teaching our children at the earliest ages what ageism is, how to avoid it, and how to have more productive behaviors towards older persons.
Excellent. Jose, one idea.
Heard that 50 is the new 70, or 60 is the new 50, and things like that. And I think that is very real. And I think that the health of the population is improving. So now in terms of career and even health, we're reaching in our 50s what we used to reach in our 40s or in our 30s in some cases. So I do think that the concept of what an older person is shifting towards an older age. So I definitely would want to emphasize that. So this concept is dynamic, I think, is one thing. The other thing is, I think technology, although is being presented in terms of age and ageism as something that is a barrier, it's also an incredible enabler. I think technology is actually enabling older people to be more engaged, to engage socially, to be more engaged in work, to be more productive. And so I think we have to try to emphasize approaches in which technology can be taken advantage of.
Thank you very much. Helen.
I was going to agree with Jeffrey. I think we should start with our children, and we should start, from the minute children are born. We talk about racism and sexism. We should talk about ageism as serious as any other form of discrimination. And the other thing I was going to say is I think we need to be fearless as well. All of us in this room, we need to kind of call out ageism when we see it. And I know that sounds like a burden, but we need to all go ahead and just go, hey, that's not on. And I'll leave it there.
Outstanding. Okay. We've got a couple of minutes left, and because all of you asked questions about sex, I'm going to just put them into a category here. Lots of questions that ask, why does the research have a cutoff date of like 80 years old and then doesn't consider further than that for sexual activities of older persons? Where can we get more information on this? It's difficult to find information on sexuality in older persons. What does people want to know more in depth about what we mean when we talk about the sexuality of older persons and how they're dealing with these questions? I've got so many questions on this category, but I'll just maybe I'll just ask you, Jeff, where can people get more information on this important issue?
Certainly, I guess the easiest answer is go on the internet and put in the search words of older persons and sexuality. Of course, there are many journals that you can look up as far as that's concerned. But, I think really the most important thing about that is actually looking up the information. We think we know this stuff. We think this is, this is information that other people know. This is what's so important about what's happening here today. We're saying the words. We're putting the labels out there. We're putting the ideas out there. We're empowering other people, and we're empowering ourselves as older persons. I was using the term senior for the longest time, and I was educated by reading, by the people that I'm working with. That it's important to use that term senior persons. So the information is out there. Grab it whichever way you can. Spend the time with it. It's absolutely great information. And I just want to say, if I don't get a chance to speak again, just be so proud as being senior people, because it is probably one of the best places you'll ever want to be in life.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're with you on that. So many other questions here, and we don't want to make them all go away in vain. Just to say that Chapter 2 of this conversation has been defined by all of you. People in the audience are asking to know more about activism by and in solidarity with older persons for their human rights and how we can work in our communities to do so. To look at issues of violence against older persons, including domestic violence within the homes of older persons. To look more at questions of care of older persons and what it means when an older person declines or resists care and the expression of their autonomy. Also looking at more issues piqued by Helen around prison and what kind of health care and palliative care and end-of-life care people are getting when they are older persons in prison, looking at how the community can play a role in dealing with these issues as well. Age segregation within prisons and the implications of that. We've got questions about ageism in the United Nations. Thank you very much for that as well. Beginning with the great challenge about mandatory retirement, which happens here as it does in other places. On what basis are people compelled to retire just because they've reached some arbitrary age? Is that a human rights approach? I think not. Issues of the mental health of older persons. The role of older persons in fighting for gun control to make our societies safer places. The issue of older persons who are refugees or who find themselves in humanitarian or natural disasters. How do we make sure that their rights are protected in that context? The issue of gender in older persons and attitudes toward older women, in particular when they are beyond childbearing years, and how that reinforces discrimination against them. And dozens of more questions on all of these very, very important issues that get to the very heart and soul of the issue of the human rights of older persons. This conversation is going to continue. We encourage you to continue it by using that hashtag UNIDOP and to carry on with your own ideas on the answers here. In the meantime, we've only got enough time left to thank all of you, to thank our sponsors, and to thank our panelist, Jose Alejandro Luxinger, Director of the Center on Aging and Health Disparities at Columbia University Medical Center, Helen Codd, Professor of Social Justice and Law at the University of Central Lancashire in England, Jeffrey Gardere, psychologist and talk show host in the United States, and Miroslava Matic, a member of the Red Cross in Serbia. And thanks, all of you. The conversation continues.
Thank you, friends, neighbors, colleagues. Thank my friends from all over the world. What a great presentation you made today. Thank you. Now we have a little bit more. If you can please stay there at the desk, and I will ask Janet to come back and speak to you.
I want to say that's the fastest moving and the most enlightening and fun IDOP that we've ever had. Don't quote me on that because I'll deny it. It's my pleasure to introduce Laya Shikongo, who is the rapporteur of the General Assembly's 9th session of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, and she will talk to you about important progress that we hope will be made pretty soon on the convention, which I can't mention, but
Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lahia and I'm from Namibia, and I'm also the rapporteur of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging here at the UN. I was actually remarking earlier to Amal that today back home in Namibia, they buried my grandmother who died at the ripe old age of 99. So I thought it was a little apt to mention that today as well. Thank you. I'm honored to be here today and join this distinguished group of speakers and participants in celebrating older human rights champions. I would also like to thank the NGO Committee on Aging for inviting me to come deliver closing remarks on behalf of the Bureau of the 9th session of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. And what better time to promote, engage, and reflect on the human rights of older persons than as we count down to celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, turning 70 this coming December. Today's event is connected to other events taking place in the United Nations, one of which is the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. This group was established 8 years ago by the General Assembly to strengthen the protection of the human rights of older persons. Our mandate is clear: to consider the existing international framework of the human rights of older persons and identify possible gaps and how best to address them, including by considering, as appropriate, the feasibility of further instruments and measures. Ladies and gentlemen, the working group sessions are an important opportunity for governments to hear from and engage in an interactive discussion with a broad variety of stakeholders, including experts, UN system, non-governmental organizations, and more recently, national human rights institutions. In fact, I'm proud to note that the open-ended working group on aging undertook a landmark decision in 2016 to become the first UN intergovernmental body outside the Human Rights Council to enable the participation of national human rights institutions in its work. Since then, we have seen an increase in the number of A-status institutions accredited to the group. And I'm also pleased to note that in our last session held in July, we have seen a record number of 42 non-governmental organizations securing accreditation to the group for the first time. I'm happy to report that on the 9th session, we engaged in a general debate on the topic, Measures to Enhance the Promotion and Protection of the Human Rights and Dignity of Older Persons. 2 interactive discussions on autonomy and independence and long-term and palliative care, as well as an interactive discussion on normative elements to follow up on the examination of the focus areas of the 8th session, which are equality and non-discrimination and violence, neglect, and abuse. We also had the opportunity to engage in an enlightened dialogue with the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, Ms. Rosa Confeld-Mate. Her recent reports submitted to the 39th session of the Human Rights Council last month examined social exclusions, concepts, their various manifestations, and the impact on the human rights of older persons. I'd also like to remark here that Ms. Rosa Confeld-Mate was also a participant yesterday in the work of the 3rd committee, which is currently undergoing. During the intersessional period, the chair requested members of the working group and other relevant stakeholders to submit substantive input on the 2 focus areas selected for the 9th session: autonomy and independence, and long-term and palliative care. The group received a total of 84 inputs that are available online, so I encourage you to visit the group's website for more information about this session. While delegations still hold divergent views on the best way to promote and protect the human rights of older persons, including enhancing the use of existing legal instruments and/or developing a dedicated instrument, the delegations were unanimous, reaffirming the success of using this new working method that took effect last year to focus on more substantive inputs and discussions. I believe we are now shifting away from polarized positions towards a step-by-step approach to engage in substantive discussions toward consensus building. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the next steps? Preparations are underway for the 10th session of the working group, which will focus on education, training, lifelong learning and capacity building, and social protection and social security, including social protection floors. As was done in preparation for the last session, the Bureau will call for the contributions of inputs on these areas, which will then be summarized to guide our discussions in the upcoming session. The Bureau will also replicate previous practice and call for normative input to follow up on the issues examined at the 9th session, which are autonomy and independence and long-term and palliative care. We believe that the organization of intersessional conferences and dialogues represent an excellent opportunity to continue the constructive debate we have in New York. And in that context, we welcome the announcement by the delegation of Austria with regard to the organization of an international conference on human rights of older persons to be held from 12 to 13 November in Vienna. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the chair of the entire Bureau, I thank you for inviting us to join you today to celebrate older human rights champions. Let us mark the International Day of Older Persons by honoring our pledge to build a life of dignity and human rights for all. I encourage you all to become part of this effort, and I invite you to actively participate in the future sessions of the working group. I thank you.
Thank you for that very timely and important update. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone that the Committee on Aging knows very, very well, and Amal Abu Rafe, who is now, I can say officially, the Chief of the Program on Aging Unit in UN DESA, and we are delighted to have her give some closing remarks.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. As we approach the end of our program, please allow me to address the older women and men of the civil society community that works on aging at the New York, who are mostly all here with us today. Today, as we commemorate the 28th anniversary of the International Day of Older Persons, we also celebrate you, our human rights champions. Now, I'm not just being courteous, I can actually back this up. When I first joined the aging team, I remember meeting you all, a group of extraordinary older women and men leading civil society organizations at the UN. I recall the difficulties you faced to position yourselves in relation to other areas of activism with higher profile on the political agenda, such as youth, persons with disabilities, women, and also the challenges you confronted to access delegations and interact with them on behalf of your constituents. Over the years, I have seen you build coalitions and alliances. I have seen you use evidence in influencing policymakers. I have seen you develop an insight on the strategic moments to intervene. You are our champions. You're the ones who raised awareness on the reality of the barriers that older persons face in the enjoyment of their human rights. You're the ones that caution that age discrimination and ageism are wildly tolerated across the world and that older persons continue to be highly vulnerable to abuse, deprivation, and exclusion. You are the ones who have driven the agenda to draw attention to mental health and palliative care needs of older persons. You're the ones who, for the first time ever, placed and prioritized older women in the selection process of the United Nations Trust Fund to end violence against women. And you're the ones who helped trigger UN mechanisms to address data gaps in aging, paving the way for better age disaggregated data that covers critical areas of older people's lives. Today and every day, we salute you. I would like to express my gratitude to the panel members and to our moderator, I'm going to pronounce it, Mr. Craig Mkhayber, who did a wonderful job facilitating the session and engaging the audience fully. I wish to underscore my appreciation to Ms. Janet Segal and Mr. James O'Neill for organizing this event, and to thank the missions of Argentina, Chile, and also welcoming our honor guest, Ariel Gonzalez from Argentina, and also the group of friends and our colleagues at OHCHR for sponsoring and co-sponsoring the event. I also wish to thank all of those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes and were instrumental in the success of today's event: Maria Rosa Rivora, Ms. Myra Sorto, Pilar Eugenio, Denise Hauser, and our very own Shatum Fila, Amin Lamrabat, Simia Wang, and our very special stage manager, Mr. Terry Benson. Thank you. It is also my pleasure to introduce you all to my colleague, Caroline Schmidt. Can you say hi? Caroline is the Chief of Fertility and Population Aging Section at our Population Division, whom we work very closely with. And I want to take this opportunity to thank her for sharing her team's latest publications, which you all have with you today. The latest of which is the Household Side and Composition Around the World. It's been published in 2017. And if you don't have one, please do grab one on your way out. And if you would indulge me for a moment, I also want to take this opportunity to wish Rosemary Lane all the best in her new role at the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch. And strategically, we made sure to keep her close in the office, in the desk nearby, right next to me. I've worked with Rosie for almost 7 years, and she's been a great boss and a dear friend and a mentor to me. I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate my colleague, Ms. Lisa Einbinder, on her promotion. We're incredibly happy for you, and we wish you much success in your new position. Lisa will be working on issues of governance and public administration at the UN. In the words of Star Trek's Dr. Spock, however, using a much improved upon version of Francis Zainadine, live long and prosper with dignity. Thank you very much for being here and for your attention.
Amal neglected to let you know that she has recently been promoted, so thank you. It's a promotion well deserved. We are at a close. I thank you all for coming out this morning and being with us. I thank the panel. It's been an exceptional day, and this formally closes the 28th celebration of the International Day of the Older Persons here at the United Nations in New York. Those of you who have registered for lunch, the lunch is just about 4 blocks away. It's on 41st Street at 3rd Avenue, right on the corner, sin igual, which means without equal. Okay, so this is highly appropriate for what we've been doing today. So you should go over there, but please remember, you have to exit up the stairs and out onto the 3rd floor. Only those who have indicated and have special passes can use the 2nd floor exit. And unfortunately, well, fortunately, but unfortunately for some people, we have fully extended our luncheon invitations, so we cannot accept new invitations at the door. We're sorry for that. Thank you, and we'll see you around October 1st next year.